Today is the fifth and the last of the series devoted to the development of Paul's theology as demonstrated by the letter to the churches of Galatia in northern Turkey. I wanted to start with a couple of, maybe three, fairly general comments to put a little bit of this into some perspective. We today describe the notion of justification by faith. It's the shorthand that we use to describe this very, very complicated notion of theology that has its origin in the letter to the Galatians. And I wanted to very, very quickly sort of review with you how that notion developed. Of course, the first time we see it in Scripture is in the letter to the Galatians. And in the letter to the Galatians, Paul is using this justification argument as one of 5 arguments that he makes to convince the people of Galatia that they don't have to be good Jews first in order to be good Christians. And so he had a very, very limited objective. And that objective was basically to convince people who had been told otherwise by more conservative Jewish Christians that they didn't have to convert to Judaism, and they did not have to comply with the hundreds of cultic rules of Judaism that are contained in the Torah. Paul developed that concept himself over the course of the next several years, and about 10 years later, when he published his letter to the Romans, his great theological work, and probably the last piece of writing that we have, at least now, from the hands of Paul, he added a major concept, and that was the notion of grace. The fact that the notion of justification by faith is not something we have to work for. It's something that the Holy Spirit gives us. And therefore, we're free to say yes. It's not something we earn. It's something we all have. He also expands it by this point in his theological career to make it quite clear that the redemptive act of the crucifixion was for all peoples, not just the chosen peoples, and therefore the grace of the Holy Spirit is available to all peoples. About 1,300 years later, Luther took the next step with respect to the development of this notion. He happened to be preaching, he was a monk at that time, happened to be preaching at a time when the church had become very, very corrupt, and indulgences were being sold, and people were being told they had to do certain things in order to achieve salvation. And of course, many of those things involved giving or doing things for the church, to enrich the church. And so Luther pointed back to this justification by faith, and he basically transformed this notion that you didn't have to be a good Jew, that you didn't have to pay attention to the rules of the Torah, to being, you didn't have to be a legalist. You didn't have to pay attention to all of these indulgence rules and other exacting rules that the church was imposing on the people at that time. Believe it or not, since that time, the notion of justification by faith has continued to develop. There were 2 major consequences of this notion that occurred. The first was an almost immediate consequence, and that was it invited Gentiles to become Christians. And probably by the time Paul died, 10 or 15 years later, Gentiles were in a clear majority as Christians in the Roman Empire. And the entire notion of Christianity had been set on its head. It was no longer a sect of Judaism. It was a church of Gentiles, most of whom didn't know what it meant to be a Jew. It turns out that about 10 years after Paul's death, and after the destruction of the Second Temple, the more conservative rabbis of Judaism, who had not become Christians, and who were regularly preaching to the Jews that Jesus was not the Messiah because he had died and the Jews were not yet free of Roman occupation. And therefore, Jesus, by definition, could not possibly have been the Messiah. And so in 76, there was some sort of a meeting in a place not too far from present-day Jaffa or Yaffo in modern Israel, attended by, we believe, hundreds of rabbis. And they adopted some changes to the basic prayers of Judaism, which began to condemn Christians. They basically threw the gauntlet down, basically saying that Jews and Christians weren't the same. You may recall that when we read the Beatitudes appear twice in the Gospels. They appear in both Luke and in Matthew. In one of the versions of the Gospel of the Beatitudes, in Luke, they're only blessed be, blessed be, blessed be. But in Matthew's version, it's blessed be, but cursed be that. Well, Matthew's Gospel basically follows the pattern of this introductory blessing or benediction. I want to use the word benediction, but it would have been the introductory prayer in a meeting of men who would get together to study the Torah. And by the middle 80s, that prayer had been modified to essentially condemn. Cursed be those who accept Jesus as the Messiah. And so we have this dramatic change in the notion of Christianity. The next consequence, of course, of Paul's justification by faith was the Great Schism that didn't occur for another 1,300 years and was probably the greatest tragedy in the history of Christianity, in that it created not only people at ideological war with each other, but in physical wars with each other for control of countries all over Western Europe. We look at the idea of justification by faith and several other concepts in isolation. Frankly, it's the only way I know how to talk about them. But I think it's important for us to recognize that there are four related philosophical, theological questions that need to be looked at together as well as independently. Obviously, the first of those is justification by faith, the very notion that a human being has the ability to say yes and be saved without doing anything more. The second notion, of course, is that is made possible because of redemptive theology, the notion that Jesus, by dying on the cross and being resurrected, has once and forever healed, reconciled humanity with God. And so those two notions have to be basically put together. And of course, Paul states in the letter to the Galatians that the redemptive act of Jesus, being the definitive act, is all that's required. And that if you do more than that, you are somehow suggesting that you haven't accepted the basic notion of Jesus' freely given redemption. The third concept, of course, developed within a few years was the notion of grace, that it comes freely to all of us, that it's not something we have to earn. And then the fourth, and that's the one I'm going to spend a little bit of time about this morning, is that there are consequences to saying yes. And this is a debate which has been going on within Christianity since the time of Luther. And that is the question of, you've all heard the phrase, faith without good works is dead. Well, it turns out that when Luther made his arguments about justification by faith, he immediately translated Paul's condemnation of the requirement that you needed to pay attention to the rules of the Torah into good works. And unfortunately, the words in Greek that Paul uses in Galatians permits that translation. And as a consequence, Luke immediately transfers this notion that where Paul was talking about the Torah, Luther is talking about good works. And it created this debate as to what the role of good works was. Now, Paul, being a practical theologian, now you've heard that word before, okay? He basically founds these churches, and he's very, very practical. He watches how they grow, and he changes his theology to account for the growth in those churches. And so, Paul certainly recognizes that just saying yes to the conversion power of the redemption is not enough unless it somehow changes you internally. Because Paul recognizes that if you don't change, if you don't become a good moral person, if the community you live in doesn't help you to become that good moral person and itself become a good moral community, then the very notion that you are converting is a lie. That if you don't change internally, you don't get there. Some have suggested that good works were necessary. And in fact, if you read the first letter of John in the New Testament, it strongly suggests that good works are necessary. I think Paul would put it a different way. I think Paul would say, if you are not engaged in good works on a regular basis in your life and as needed and in your community, then you aren't converted. You didn't really say yes. I think Paul would sort of take that step back and say, and of course, how do we know this? Well, look at the letter to the Galatians. That letter, like most of his other letters, ends, the last third of the letter to the Galatians is almost like another letter. It's entirely different from the first 2/3 of the letter. What does Paul talk about in the last third of that letter? He talks about the fruits of the Spirit. He talks about good works. He talks about the consequences of a moral life in a community. And he talks about both a community being moral and an individual being moral. Both. And as a consequence of that, the notion that Paul was arguing in Galatians against good works is, I believe, incorrect, is false. Because Paul certainly recognized in the very same letter the importance of good works. And so I think the answer to that is a very simple one. And that is, Paul would go back and say, if you are not leading a good life, you're not converted. You're lying. You really didn't say yes. You just made believe you said yes.
John?
Yes.
May I? I'm just thinking about the Samaritan. I'm thinking about the Samaritan.
Okay.
And the Samaritan does good works. Could the Samaritan not receive grace because of good works? Does he have to convert? Is he not living the life the way it should be lived?
Did you all hear the question? Okay. First of all, a Samaritan would have been a Jew.
I understand.
Okay? And he would have been completely familiar with the Torah and the 600 plus rules of the Torah, which would have included those good works. That's number one. I think the second notion is a bigger notion that you're raising, and that is one that Christianity has been struggling with for generations. And that is, can a non-Christian be saved? You've all heard that question asked, I'm sure, okay? And current theological thinking in Christian churches, both Catholic and Protestant, is identical on that subject. And they begin to talk about the notion of spiritual conversion, that or spiritual baptism is the phrase you sometimes hear, or baptism by desire. And that is basically a way of saying someone can convert, can say yes to the grace of God without even knowing that that's what they're doing. And that is, of course, the result of the fact, and you read that through how they act, how their lives are lived. Okay? And I think that's how Christianity has attempted to deal with that same issue even today. Okay. Other questions? Another comment on that? No?
Not beyond, thank you.
Okay. Your notes will take you the next step, which I'll briefly go through. And that is the notion that Paul, being a practical theologian, certainly recognized that it was not possible to live only with the law of love your God and love your neighbor, and say yes to the redemptive act, that you needed to live a moral life. And so he had to come up with, or he had to think about, how does that happen? And I think Paul's answer is community. I think Paul places on community the responsibility for ensuring that its members lead moral lives. And that's done in several ways. The most extreme, of course, he describes in the letter to the church in Thessalonica, of which we had a reading this morning, in which he basically suggests that the community needs to discipline its members, and if they've been disciplined a few times and they still don't respond, they need to be ostracized. They need to be thrown out of the community. That's certainly the most extreme measure that Paul describes in his letters. But I think if you look at the letters in general, particularly the letter to the Corinthians, you see a notion that it's the community's responsibility to help each of us form conscience. And that's why when we talk about these classes, we don't talk about them as lectures. We talk about them as formation exercises, okay? Because there are two ways to act every day. I mean, one way you can act is sort of automatically. You know, when you come to a stoplight and it's red, you stop, okay? That's a rule. Stop when you come to a corner with a red traffic light, okay? But that has basically just been ingrained into us over a long period of time. If you think about it seriously, you would say to yourself, well, why should I do that? And the answer, of course, is if you don't stop, you could cause an accident and you could injure yourself or others or kill someone. And so there's a basic moral judgment behind the rule of the red light, okay? And so what we try to do in formation of conscience, and of course, theologians today are always talking about conscience. I mean, it is the primacy of conscience, and you see it in all the demonstrations in the for liberation of the colonies. You see it in various legislative demonstrations, etc. People talk about the primacy of conscience. Well, it recognizes the fact that each of us has a responsibility personally to act morally. Think about that. I mean, that statement, I just made that statement very, very casually, but think about the notion. It is not a universally held notion that people have a responsibility to act morally. There are some who don't understand or believe that notion. okay? But I think we as Christians, would normally accept the notion that it is our responsibility to act morally. We might want to debate about what moral means in a given situation, but the very notion of acting morally remains the same. I think that what we're trying to get at here is a notion of having an automatic internal mechanism that helps us to make the right decision on the spot when we don't have a rule that says do A or B. And that's not easy. And certainly psychologists have told us over and over again that the formation of conscience starts almost at birth, and that it is almost fully formed by the time we are in our 20s. And it's very, very hard to take an adult and form that adult's conscience. It has to be done at an earlier point in life. And it's, of course, one of the reasons why Christian churches like Trinity take youth education, youth formation so seriously. Because if you don't get them then, you're not going to get them at all. And so I think Paul certainly recognizes the responsibility of community to help form conscience. I would make one other comment about the notion of justification by faith, which is a fairly modern concept. Theologians have been writing about it now for about the last 15 or 20 years. They've all been trying to explain in various modern terms what justification by faith means. And what they basically have come down to, or many of them have come down to in the last few years, is the notion of human pride. And that if we think we can earn heaven, that is a basic statement of personal pride. That we think we are capable of earning. And that justification by faith is a way of giving up pride and basically saying, Holy Spirit, help me to understand what this faith is and what the consequences of this faith are. And I will accept that. And I will place myself in your hands. It's a basic notion of giving up human pride. And I rather like that psychological concept as a way of trying to explain what Paul was getting at when he talked about justification by pride. All right, I'm going to sort of run through a bit now of where we go with the end of this letter and where it ended up. Of course, it being one of Paul's letters, it contains the four parts that we talked about: the greeting, the argument, the exhortatory or the moral preaching. And then at the end, there would have been a call upon certain individuals for blessings. This alone, among all of Galatians alone, among all of Paul's letters, doesn't follow the pattern. If you remember from the first class, he was very, very disdainful of the Galatian people. He didn't address them in a way that would have put them in a position where they would have said, yes, this is a good letter. They wouldn't have been very happy with the letter. And it turns out that at the end of the letter, he does the same thing again. And that is, he doesn't mention anybody at the end of the letter for praise. He doesn't give thanks to anybody for their work on behalf of the Galatian people. And so that leads us to question, what happened next? Well, there is no evidence that Paul ever went back to the churches of Galatia. He certainly didn't tell us that he did. We don't know how they received his letter either, although it was copied and kept, so we know they did receive it. We do know, as a matter of fact, that the churches of Galatia flourished. If you go to north central Turkey today, they have excavated at least 6 what they call basilicas. A basilica does not have to be a giant structure. Basilica is the form of a church with a rounded nave that faces east, and it's the structure of an early Christian church. We know there are at least the ruins of at least 6 of those in and around the area we now call Galatia in north central Turkey. The sizes of those churches suggest that there were thousands and thousands of Christians by the second century in that area of the world. We also know from the later traditional history of Christianity that some of the greatest thinkers of the early church, the men we call the fathers of the church, I don't know where the women were, but we call them the fathers of the church, were from this area. And the Turkish fathers were among the most prolific writers in the 2nd and 3rd century on the basic concepts of Christianity that ultimately were adopted in the Nicene Creed in the beginning of the 4th century and really became foundational for Christianity. So we know that Galatia was probably an important part of the development of early Christianity, but probably not with any of Paul's participation. Almost immediately after he wrote this letter, which we think he wrote in Ephesus, he returned to Corinth, and he had been having lots of problems with Corinth. Those of you who've read the letters to the Corinthians know that that was not an easy church, a series of churches for Paul to deal with. He collected a lot of money from the churches in Corinth, and then he returned to Jerusalem with that treasury. You may remember I told you in an earlier class that at this particular time in history, both Jews and Christian communities in Jerusalem were not self-sustaining and relied upon the contributions of adherents to their religion from outside of Jerusalem. And there was a tradition of raising money for the churches, the Judaic community and the Christian community in Jerusalem. And this, on the occasion of one of those collections, Paul took this very large treasury. He describes it as very large actually he doesn't. Luke describes it as very large in the Acts of the Apostles. He takes it to Jerusalem. We think probably to try to patch things up, because we think that by that time the more conservative Christians in Jerusalem were in control. Remember that by that point, both Peter had left Jerusalem, was probably in Rome. John had left and was probably in Ephesus, which left James, the conservative of the 3 pillars of the church. So we think the Jerusalem church was probably quite conservative by that time. At any rate, Paul arrived with the funds, and he was immediately accused of attempting to bribe the church. And he thought he found a way of handling it. There were a group of men who were referred to by the name Nazarites. You may have heard that word before. These were either widows or other celibate men who dressed in simple robes and prayed 24/7 for the church. And of course, they had no means of support. And so Paul is invited, according to Luke, to give the treasury to the Nazarites. And while he's there, bringing it to the Nazarites, a dispute arose. It's described as an insurrection by the Romans. Paul was arrested for insurrection, ultimately was transferred to what we would call Caesarea Maritima today on the coast. He demanded a trial in Rome because he was a Roman citizen, so he was transported to Rome. And he wrote the letter to the Romans, most likely from prison in Rome, when he was about probably 64 or 65. And then we don't know anything more about him. Some traditions of the church tell us he went to Spain and died in Spain. The accepted tradition of the church is that he was martyred in Rome, crucified, when he was 67 years old, the same year that Peter was crucified in Rome. And that's why even today in the church, in our liturgies, we celebrate the feasts of Peter and Paul on the same day, because they both were martyred in the same year. At any rate, the letters became very, very popular pieces of literature in the Christian church. They were copied and handwritten over and over. You notice the words at the end of Galatians. He basically, Paul says, written in my hand. You'd think that'd be a very strange way of describing, but of course at that particular time in history, most people, like Paul, would have dictated their letters to secretaries, and apparently Paul wrote some of the words of the letter to the Galatians himself. We're not exactly sure which words and how. Unfortunately, we do not have the original letter. In fact, we don't have the original manuscripts of any book of the New Testament. The oldest manuscripts we have date back to the beginning of the 4th century, close to 300 years after many of them were written. And so, of course, we don't know what happened to Paul's letters. There is tradition in the church that the slave that he freed, who's described in the letter to Philemon, Onesimus, began the collection of Paul's letters in the 70s and collected them all in one place. Curiously, the church historians have now discovered that Onesimus was an early bishop in the area between present-day Ankara and Galatia, which is a very, very interesting sidelight to this notion, if in fact he was the one who collected Paul's letters. So, at any rate, we now have all of Paul's letters. I want to make it quite clear. Someone asked me a question after the last class, and it made me think that I had not made something clear in the notes. I do describe in the notes how Paul's letters were compiled and written, and I describe the fact that only 7 of the letters that are contained in the New Testament are reliably attributed to Paul himself, and that the other half were probably written by Paul's disciples, maybe with his participation, perhaps not. We think, for example, that the letter to the Ephesians was probably written 10 or 15 years after his death. And so it was obviously not written by Paul. But I wanted to make one thing clear, and that is, despite the fact that most of the letters, just over half, were clearly written by Paul, and the others were probably written by his disciples. 1 or 2 of them may not have even been written by his disciples. For centuries, the letter to the Hebrews was described as Paul's letter to the Hebrews. And all of the churches in the World Council of Churches no longer refer to the letter to the Hebrews as Paul's letter to the Hebrews. It's generally believed it was written sometime around 115 or 120, at least 50 years after Paul and his disciples had died. But despite the fact that some of these letters, which are attributed to Paul, weren't actually written by him, we do believe that they represented many of his ideas, most of his ideas, and followed the other teaching that he had during his lifetime. And then there's the important concept, which is that the canon of the New Testament, which didn't exist until the 3rd century, does in fact contain all of the letters of Paul that we call the Pauline letters today. And so I didn't want to convey to you the impression that somehow we were looking at some letters that were somehow inauthentic. You'll remember that at this time of history, it was not unusual for letters and other written documents to be attributed to third parties as a matter of honor, that you were essentially dedicating to someone else. Perhaps I saw an article only just a few months ago about the fact that it seems likely that Matthew's gospel was written by perhaps by one of Matthew's sons, and that it was attributed to Matthew as being Matthew's gospel. Doesn't mean it's any less Matthew's gospel. It was just an interesting argument that was made. So I presented the letter to the Galatians to you this year, primarily because it's what Nicholas asked me to do. But secondly, because as I got into it and started really studying it myself, I began to realize how critical it was in the development of Paul's theology during his lifetime, and how much more approachable that it is than Romans when you start talking about the notions of justification by faith. And then I realized, of course, how critically important, sorry about that, how critically important this letter was in the historic development of the church that we call our church today. I will take questions. Okay, thanks.